A very good evening, viewers, and welcome to Citti Media and the Festival of Bharat. Today, we are joined by somebody incredibly special. He's been on our platforms before and is very popular with our audience. He is somebody who represents our culture, the values. He's very polite and civil, but if push comes to shove, you don't want to be messing with such a person. And I will be sharing why as General Hooda ji joins us for a conversation and shares his valuable insights on many issues that we'll be discussing today. General Hooda ji, first of all, my pranams to you for all the seva and the sacrifice that you've done to this country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And great pleasure to be here with you.
It's an honor for us to have you here again. General Hooda, let me begin by asking you this. We witnessed a very unfortunate demise of our CDS, his wife, and 11 other members of the armed forces. The CDS himself was an incredible human being, and you were very close to him. Can you share some of your personal experiences and some anecdotes, and what was he as a human being?
So as you said, it's an incredible tragedy, and coming to terms with it for some of us who knew both him and his wife, it's a little difficult. So it's also like a sort of a personal loss. We worked together in numerous sort of, not so much in a personal as a professional capacity. We were army commanders together, and then of course, when I was at Northern Command, he went on to become the vice chief of the army staff. So I always found him, very warm, generous, and very, very correct in his approach. He was one person who was, highly, highly determined. In some ways, also controversial because he was a person who didn't mince his words, and there were many people who sort of, didn't like what he said and the manner in which he said it. But I think he had a huge, huge amount of, courage of conviction that what he needs to do and how he needs to do it. And if it's right for the organization, then it must be pursued in a very, very sort of determined manner. So I recall, for example, when we were planning the surgical strikes, I used to go to the army headquarters for briefings, to the chief. And as the vice chief, of course, he was always present there. And we used to discuss our plans, and he used to come out with a lot of good advice. He himself, as a major general, had actually served in that area. Right. He was at Baramulla as a GOC, so he knew the area very well. He knew the line of control very well. So he, gave some very, very good suggestions on how we need to do, and that sort of helped us, refine our plans. After I had retired, I was tasked to undertake a study for the restructuring in the army. And that's the time when General Rawat had been appointed the Chief of Army Staff. And I had, some interactions with him. And what struck me was, his openness to new ideas, his openness and, desire to bring in change and reform in the Indian Army at that stage. So these are some of his qualities that I think are very admirable.
And what is the biggest thing about General Rawat ji that we need to be aware of in your perspective?
So if you look, he, as I said, I mean, he achieved sort of what every army officer can aspire to be. I mean, he became the chief of the army staff, and then he was appointed as the first CDS in India. Right. And I think it is in his role as CDS that I think people should remember, and in which he sort of really, really excelled. So firstly, as a newly appointed CDS, his own office of the CDS, then there was a new department created called the Department of Military Affairs, which took on a number of duties which were earlier carried out by the Ministry of Defense. Right. So he had to actually, put policies, put processes in place to get these departments up and running. And side by side along with this, he also had to carry out, structural reforms within the military. So when you look back at his tenure, which is less than 2 years, the pace at which he went about his work was, to me, highly, highly impressive. I think the manner in which he did his work and the speed at which he brought it in, he's really left very big shoes to fill.
Right. And speaking about the role of the CDS, it's more of an organizational role rather than an operational role. In the sense that ever since the Kargil Review Committee was formed and we had a lot of suggestions from there, the implementation and establishment of the role of CDS was pending for a very long time, and it finally took shape in the last few years. How has this been very imperative to our reform, sir?
So see, we've always felt for a long time in the military that integration and jointness within the three services was something that needed to be improved upon. What was happening is, all the three services were carrying out, the Army, Navy, Air Force, were carrying out their operational planning within their service headquarters and integrating these plans and making a joint warfighting strategy was somewhat lacking. So I think one of the major tasks that General Rawat undertook was one that he centered his reforms around jointness and integration. And so you hear about the proposal for integrated theater commands that has been started. Now, what is the final shape and structure is something that can be debated. But the fact is, integration is absolutely necessary in today's war fighting.
Right.
And the second thing is, you see, you might demand any amount of money. The fact is, budgets are always going to be limited.
Right.
And so therefore, greater efficiency is needed to be brought to, in the budgetary planning process. And that's again where, the CDS was bringing in sort of prioritization, inter-service prioritization, which service requires what. Otherwise, obviously, each service makes its own demand. And therefore, capability development planning, greater efficiency in military budgeting, these are areas I think in which he did a lot of work.
General Hooda ji, you also wrote a very heartfelt tribute to General Rawat ji. And if I may ask a couple of questions from what you wrote in that particular article, which I felt was very passionate and imperative in terms of where we go from here.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote, and I quote you, it is now widely accepted that information is the new domain of warfare, and information dominance will be the key to winning both conventional and gray zone wars. For our viewers who may not know how important the weightage of your words are, can you please elaborate on what exactly you meant by that?
Okay, so it's been a military truism, and for a very, very long time, that battles are won or lost in the minds of commanders.
Right.
So if a commander psychologically feels he's losing, he will probably lose. And so what is the information that comes to him is extremely important. What has happened over the years, and particularly in recent time, is the pace and volume of information has tremendously increased.
Right.
How we are processing information, how we are consuming information, how we are using this information for our decision making has become very, very important. And therefore, I talked about information dominance. So if this information dominance is lost, if the information chain is somehow broken, then the commander will find himself without adequate inputs to take decisions. Now you could say it happened in the past also, but as I said, the volume of information has tremendously increased.
Right.
There is so much interconnectedness of information between various systems. There is this dependency. The other thing that has changed is propaganda and fake news being employed for psychological conditioning of people.
Right.
So imagine the impact of fake news on a group of people, and then you have the political leadership and the military leadership, which could also get influenced by these. Right. So you are finding around the world, so military is talking about information warfare, the Chinese talking about intelligentized warfare. You're talking of psychological information sort of systems,
Right.
to be able to for psychological conditioning, impacting the decision making process of leadership. So this is where I think information has become absolutely critical. And I talked about war and gray zone warfare, and this is a tool that is not limited to only warfare.
Mhm.
Psychological impact through use of information is being practiced around the world in even in peacetime.
Right.
So it isn't as if this tool is only going to be used in war. So
Correct.
it's across the whole spectrum, and that's why I talked about really the importance of information warfare today.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And in fact, when we look at the systems that great powers have developed, whether it's Russia or the United States, I mean, they do have a little more nuanced way of establishing these structures in the form of United States Information Agency, or before that, it was the I think Committee on Information Warfare or something. They started way back in the 40s, and I think India is a long way behind, and we need to catch up
Absolutely,
on that.
absolutely.
Right. And how can India be prepared better for a 2.5 front war? Because this is one of the things that General Bipin Rawat ji focused on.
So when we talk about a 2.5 front war, so we're talking obviously the two fronts are Pakistan and China,
Right.
and the half front is our involvement in internal security and counter-terrorist operations in Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast, because there again there are a large number of troops who are employed in this. I think what we need to do, one is uh, enunciate a national security strategy, and I'm one person who's been saying this for a very long time, that India needs to have a national security strategy which will guide our foreign policy, which will guide our defense strategy, uh, and also it will guide our military capability development. I think we need to take a sort of a long-term view of how to deal with our challenges, and particularly how to deal with rising and aggressive China. And the reason I'm focusing on the necessity of a strategy is, let us be practical enough to understand that in terms of military budgets, we will not be able to match China. I mean, with the size of their economy as compared to India, uh, it will be almost impossible for us to say that we'll spend as much as China spends on its military budget.
Right.
And so therefore, we need to look at what niche capabilities we have to develop.
Right.
And I think where we have to beat them is in our military strategy. And that's why I keep emphasizing the need for, sort of a national security strategy. If you can't beat them in, buying weapons, at least you can beat them in the superior strategic
Right.
thinking.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at the United States for that matter, with all its military superiority, technological superiority, they still, had a very embarrassing exit from Afghanistan. So, in that sense, perhaps formulation of such a strategy will be very imperative towards developing a niche, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head. So the problem in Afghanistan, for example, was not that the US military lacked capability
Right.
or that the US military lacked funds. It's just that their strategy and objectives were not very clear.
Right.
I mean, why are you there and what are you to do?
Right.
And that's why at the end of it, I think they just had to do a very embarrassing pullout from there.
Right. It's just because of that one existential question, right? Like, what are we doing here and what is the long-term objective?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And in the article that I was referring to, you conclude by saying the Goldwater-Nichols Act, reorganizing the US military, came when the policymakers lost absolute faith in the ability of the US military to overcome parochialism. Hopefully, that stage will not come. Now, I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but what do you exactly mean by that?
See, we are seeing how the processes that General Rawat started, particularly on integrated theater commands. There has been a lot of discussion and debate on that. There are some reservations that we are seeing among some services on how these integrated theater commands must come up.
Right.
And I'm all for debate and discussion. It must be held so that we get our structures right. But in the garb of saying that this structure is not right, I just hope we do not push jointness and integration back.
Right.
Oh, that is what I meant. And if the three services are not going to be able to agree, then obviously it will be time for the political leadership to step in and
Right.
say this is essential and it has to be done. And that's why I quoted the Goldwater
But do
Nichols
you
Act.
think we will actually go that far where a legislative intervention is required?
So I said I hope not.
Yeah, right. Okay,
I
so
hope we don't. I hope the office of the CDS, the three service chiefs, can sit down and sort of iron out their differences.
right,
All of them say yes, integration is the need of the hour. So as long as that principle is understood and everybody moves in that direction, and that this reform doesn't get stalled, I just hope that happens.
right. I mean, in the last few interactions with senior officers from the armed forces, what they were also telling me is that this needs to be done silently without any public differences, and that is not very becoming of the institutions that we've built. So perhaps
Absolutely.
that will happen sometime
Yeah.
in the future. So obviously, you've had a very long and distinguished career in the armed forces. You were the pioneer of the surgical strikes, and I know that you've been asked this a million times, but you've also headed very important events. So what have people forgotten about the surgical strikes that needs to be reminded again and again? And can you also give us some exclusive insights? Nothing classified, of course, but whatever can be shared in public domain.
So very broadly, so I don't think people have sort of forgotten about the surgical strike. It's something that keeps coming up.
Right.
Very broadly, sort of without going into too many operational details, let me sort of run you through the process of the planning and what happened. So that attack on the Uri garrison, in which we lost 18 soldiers, was really, really shocking for all of us. And I think very quickly, both the military leadership and the political leadership decided that we need to send out a strong response to this, and that the strong response must come early enough, not as if we can wait for months and months and then do something. The whole impact would have been lost. So we immediately sort of got around to planning for the strikes. Fortunately, our special forces had been training for this contingency for almost a year, which was why we were able to sort of very quickly, put the operation in place. So we did our planning process. I used to, quietly fly down to Delhi to discuss the plans and to brief the chief of the army staff. Come back, even within our own headquarters, very, very few people actually knew that the operation was going to take place, because we just didn't want any information about this to leak out. The operation was fairly complex in the sense that we had to hit, terrorist launch pads, and we had to do it at multiple places from across Jammu region to Kashmir region, over a frontage of almost 250 kilometers.
Right.
Multiple targets had to be hit. It had to be done the same night. And then, of course, our big concern was, people are going so deep inside. What happens if there are casualties or somebody gets hurt, and how to retrieve them? In fact, that was the really, really big sort of question in our heads, which we discussed and we debated for a long time. On the night of the operation, after what we call last light. As soon as the sun goes down, the teams went across the line of control, and the targets were actually behind Pakistan's line of forward defenses. Line of control is perhaps among the most heavily guarded borders in the world from
Yes.
both sides. And so our soldiers had to actually cross the front line of defenses, go behind, attack the targets. And of course, once the attack takes place, surprise is completely lost. And then also return, which was the more sort of dangerous part. So I was we were sitting in our, what we call the operations room, and we had these UAVs and drones over the target area, and these pictures were being beamed to us of what is going on there. And I remember the first attack went in at about midnight, and troops came back. But the last attack was to go in at 6 o'clock in the morning. So there are almost 6 hours between the first and the last attack, and which again was a little area of concern for us, that once the first attack goes in, Pakistani soldiers sort of get an inkling of what is going on. How quickly will they be able to pass the information? How prepared will they be for the last attack? Fortunately, I think they were completely shocked and surprised. So there was absolutely no reaction. So the soldiers did an outstanding job. The officers and men who went across, I think if you ask me who should take credit for the surgical strike, it's these guys, because they put their lives on the line to go across. And when everybody came back safe, huge sense of relief. So people often ask me, what was the first sort of feeling you had when everybody was back?
Yeah.
So did you feel a sense of triumph? And I said it was just a sense of relief that everybody's back.
Right.
The other feelings come a little later, but the first thing was
Right.
all the soldiers are back and safe. So as I said, the good successful operation. Maybe when we sit separately, we can talk about some more details.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. And let's also talk about China, because the incursions have increased off late, and then it's becoming a bone of contention between the two countries. No longer it's no longer the same between India and China. And let's face that. When Prime Minister Modi, I think this was a few years ago, early on during his leadership as a prime minister, he met President Xi Jinping in Gujarat. And that is when, for the first time again, when Mr. Modi took over, Chinese incursions happened. And then you were in charge, and you organized a very strong resistance and a pushback. Can you tell us more about what went behind the scenes? Because there seems to be a repetitive pattern of this. Like, when President Xi is here, then the Chinese start, moving into our territory.
But this was September 2014, when President Xi Jinping came to India, and frankly, we were very surprised that at a time like this for the Chinese to do a sort of a major incursion. So this happened in the area of what is called Chumar in eastern Ladakh. And what the Chinese were trying to do is build a road across into our area.
Right.
And again, as I said, sometimes it's the man on the spot who sets up a chain of events that lead to success. At the end of the day, senior commanders, get a pat on their back, you did a good job. But I think in this case, it was really a young officer who saw this happening.
Okay.
And the Chinese had brought in a lot of earth-moving equipment, dozers, and they were trying to construct the road. There must have been at that time 500 soldiers behind.
Okay.
And here is this young officer who rushes with 30, 40 men and just literally physically stops that road construction.
Right.
And says, yeah, you won't. So he's the guy who actually, without any orders, without anything, he just sort of rushed in and did this. And then, of course, as information came that by then the Chinese, I think, had almost 1,500 soldiers in that area. And then, of course, we also rushed in, and within, I would say, a day or two, we had actually more number of soldiers there than the Chinese had.
Right.
And so we were just facing them off, and we said, there is no way you can move forward and do this. And so it carried on for a few days, and then, of course, political level, diplomatic level talks took place. But because I think in some ways we were able to respond quickly enough and to stop them from doing, what they were attempting to do, that subsequently then the Chinese agreed to sort of withdraw from that area and go back to their post. But as I said to you earlier, again, if you ask me, I mean, who should get a pat on the back? It's that young officer, really, because if the Chinese had built the road and come into our area,
Right.
then to try and get them out would have been a little more difficult.
Right. And what would your advice be on how we can actually handle China going forward? Because, I mean, realistically, China has been able to settle a lot of boundary disputes with a lot of its neighbors. But with India, that seems to be failing, obviously, for different reasons. But since there is a repetitive pattern of this, what do you think is the way forward?
See, I think what we've had or attempted to have against China is a strategy of deterrence.
Right.
I mean, there is really, we don't have any sort of territorial ambitions into Tibet. What we want is that China should not be able to sort of put military pressure on us on a contested border, which is the LAC. And so how do we deter them from doing that? And in the long term, that's what we have to think about. Has our strategy of deterrence weakened against China? Which is why China did what it did, the PLA did last year. Before that, things were peaceful. And so if our deterrence is weakening, what are the steps we need to take? And as I said, always, somehow we react from incident to incident. We should be having and thinking about a long-term strategy.
Long-term strategy, right?
Yeah, diplomatic, political. What are the kind of military capabilities that you require? How much infrastructure building do you require on the border?
Right.
So we need a long-term plan. Look, in my view, China is going to be a major sort of challenge and threat for India as we look into the future. Just the way it is building up its military capability.
Absolutely.
And so we have to also have some long-term thinking on what we need, how do we deter China, what are the types of military capability we need? Are we still going to depend on tanks and guns, or should we look at areas like I talked about, cyber, psychological operations, information,
Right.
So this will require some sort of deep introspection. I don't think there is a quick fix answer to China.
Absolutely. And I hope you can join us for a session exclusively on China, because there is just so much to discuss.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us and taking out some time for us today. It's an absolute honor to interview you. And again, thank you so much for your seva and sacrifice for this country.
My pleasure, and wonderful interacting with you.
Thank you, sir. Absolutely. And to all our viewers, please do let us know what you thought about this interaction in the comment section below. My name is Citti, signing off.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.